Last week, we talked about the religiously unaffiliated. Who are they and what do they believe? This week, we'll talk about why they abandon religion in the first place and why some of them return. That's coming up today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Last time, we talked about the religiously unaffiliated, and I talked specifically about the Pew report that came out in 2015, I believe it was, that first clued people in that there was this trend away from religion. As I mentioned there, in the 1990s, the religiously unaffiliated hovered only around, say, 5 to 7%. But by 2015, it had reached upwards of 22 to 25%, depending on what statistics you were looking at. And that's what caught people's attention and started the interest in this growing demographic. What's going on? Why are people abandoning religion? And I talked last time about the patterns of belief that we see with the religiously unaffiliated. Now, today I want to do an update. And the reason is because what we saw recently is that in 2022, that number peaked out. In other words, the number continued to go up, reaching all the way up to 31% of the population. But in 2023, it dipped down to 28%. In other words, it seems that this demographic had been growing and is now beginning to contract. Now, I want to talk about that some of my own research on this group, on this demographic, my understanding of it, really does fit with this trend. So today, I want to talk about the evolution of a nun. I hate to have to do this again, but people are always confused by this term. The religiously unaffiliated are typically called nuns. And here, we don't mean N-U-N, as in a Catholic or an Orthodox nun. We mean N-O-N-E, none of the above. It comes from religion surveys. They check none of the above on a religion survey. They don't have any religious affiliation. So when you hear me say nun, I mean people with no religious affiliation. So today I want to talk about the evolution of a nun. What are the stages that they go through? I'm going to talk first by way of prelude about the predictive patterns. What are the things that serve to clue us in that a person is on a trajectory to abandon religion? And there's actually plenty of data on that. And then we'll talk about the stages they go through. And what's interesting, we'll even talk about the fourth stage of this evolution, which is the return to religion. What does that look like and why do people do it? So that's on the docket today. So before we talk specifically about the 4 stages of the evolution of a nun, we need to do this prelude on what are the predictive factors, which is rather informative. And here I want to talk about, well, I'm only going to talk about 3 of the 4 predictive factors. The 3 factors I'll call, just for quick and easy reference, experiential factors, existential factors, cognitive factors. Now, there are theological factors, worldview factors. I'll touch on that briefly, but that's probably worthy of its own discussion that maybe we'll have some other time. Now, with that said, let's begin by looking at the experiential factors that predict whether someone's on a trajectory to abandon religion. A lot of what I'm going to talk about here in this early stage, the experiential factors, is based on the research of Smith and Sakink, who collated decades and decades of surveys and other research in order to identify these trends. So let's talk specifically about experiential trends at home. And so these are probably not terribly surprising once we call them out, but statistically speaking, we have plenty of data to support it. The first factor is the question of whether or not you have sort of what we'll call religious homogeny in the home. I noticed this right away when I was doing interviews with nuns in preparation for my documentary on the religiously unaffiliated. Most of the nuns had at home growing up one parent who was highly religious and one who was like, I'll go to church sometime begrudgingly, but I don't really believe in it. I'm not really part of this. This isn't really my thing. Or they were just outright, they didn't believe in it. What's interesting is when you look at retention in terms of religion, and you look at dissociation, what you see is those who have religious homogeny within the home are more likely to retain their children in terms of their religion. Whereas when you have that discontinuity, one parent who believes, one who doesn't, this is a predictor for later dissociation from the religion. A second thing is whether or not the parents have a certain compliance or submission to the religion itself. So if the parents go to church, they believe what the church teaches, they advocate for that at home, and the child experiences some sort of continuity between church teaching and home upbringing, that's a predictor for them being retained, right? Them continuing within that religion. Whereas if there's a discontinuity, a disconnect between what the parents teach at home and the church, where they're saying, yes, I know the church teaches that, but that's probably not true, that disconnect between the church and the home, that's a predictor for later dissociation for the child. Another issue is family cohesion, right? So families that remain whole and, in a single unit, whether it's, parental divorce or it's something like, other sorts of fracturings in the home relationships, the fractured homes are more likely to give way to later dissociation, whereas cohesive, peaceful homes are more likely to have religious retention. Similarly, whether or not the parents are religiously active, that is, do they just go to church on Sunday or perhaps on Easter or, some other, high religious holiday, or are they actually proactively involved in the religion itself? Those who, are proactively involved in the church, where it genuinely is a significant part of their life that they're pouring themselves into, their children are likely to be retained and not abandon the religion. Whereas those who sort of are just sort of Sunday Christians or, something like that, high holiday religious people, those are more likely to end up having their children later dissociate. Also, there's the question of whether the parents are religiously active in the home. So this isn't just about, am I involved in my church, right? The question is, do you have religious traditions at home? Do you read sacred texts at home? Do you have prayer rituals at home? The more the parents are active in the sense that this faith is lived in the home, the more likely it is that their children will, remain within the religion. Whereas the less active the religion is, the less present the religion is within the home, the more likely it is that the child will at some point dissociate from the religion. In addition, religious education. Those parents who actually educate their children such that they have a sense that they really do understand what the religion is and what it teaches are more likely to retain their children within that religion, as opposed to those who do not. And the children have sort of a vague sense of the religion, but they haven't really been properly educated in it. Those are more likely to later dissociate. I can never say that word right. Dissociate. It doesn't have an A. Anyway. Also, the question is crisis. This is an interesting one. When the children see the parents encounter crisis, how do the parents react? Do they turn to the religion? Those who do turn to religion, whether it's prayer, or it's some priest, or something like that, are more likely, when their children see that, that's more likely to create an impression that ends up contributing to later retention. Whereas if the religion plays no part in how they weather a crisis, again, predictor for dissociation. Get the word right. Okay. So those are the sort of in-home experiential factors. Now, there are other factors that have to do with in the church. So when children notice that clergy are devout, right, they seem to be genuinely holy people, as opposed to hypocrites, that is a predictor for retention. That makes an impression. Whereas observing hypocrisy, right, seeing this person as not truly holy, not truly godly, not truly virtuous, that ends up being a predictor for later dissociation. Also, a sense of whether or not the clergy end up, really care about them. Those who have a sense that the clergy or the rabbi, whatever it is, cares about them as an individual and their well-being, that makes an impression that is a likely predictor for retention. Whereas if they get a sense they couldn't give a rip about me, that's a predictor for later dissociation. And also a sense of belonging. Do I have a place here, right? Am I just sort of an invisible entity floating around here? Those who have that experience likely are, that's one, predictor for later dissociation. Whereas if I have a sense that there actually is a place for me here, the community at large cares about me, that's a predictor for retention. So those are some of the experiential factors. And so if I were to give a concise summary of basically what these experiential factors are, I would put it like this. The more young people witness at home a unified embodiment of religious devotion to the church, its teachings, its worship, and its practices in church, at home, and in difficult times, and the more this devotion is not only lived but taught by word and by example, the more likely the youth is to retain faith, as opposed to dissociate. So there you have it. Those are some of the experiential predictors if we're just looking at sort of sociological traits of this. Now, I mentioned that there are also existential factors here. And there are a couple of these. I mentioned in the previous talk that oftentimes the nuns will talk about the problem of evil. And they'll say there was this, why doesn't God step in and stop this horrible thing? But once they get talking about their own personal experiences, the existential crises that they face that ended up sort of pushing them away from religion, or at least occasioning their wandering from religion, they're usually describing something closer to what's called the problem of divine hiddenness. So the problem of divine hiddenness is the philosophical problem that suggests if God is really that important to me as a human being, right, that my ultimate destiny and purpose and meaning is related to him, it's incumbent upon him to make himself known. And if he's real, why wouldn't he make himself known? Why is he so hidden, so difficult to discern his presence and all the rest? And the nuns really sort of articulate this when talking about certain things like, for example, my parents were in crisis. They were teetering on the edge of divorce, and I prayed, right? And I wanted God to intervene, and he didn't, right? Where was he? Why wouldn't he show up? Why wouldn't he answer this prayer, right? Or some other crises like that, where there's a turning to God, there's a desire for God to show up, to demonstrate that he is present, and he is real, and he cares, and he's active, and he didn't, right? That's more the issue that the nuns are describing. It's not so much the problem of evil. It's not a logic problem about omnipotence and the prevention of evil and things like that. It's where was he? So that's one issue, right? They talk about this sort of unanswered prayer, right? This desire for a presence of God. There's also an interesting thing. I talked a little bit last time about the interest in the paranormal with regard to the nuns. And I talked about how when people move away from religion, they tend to actually not become materialist atheists. The nuns tend to actually become interested in the occult and the paranormal. And I think this is sort of the flip side of part of the existential coin. Many of the nuns also talk about a desire for proof for the existence of God. And it's really clear when talking to them that very few of them mean logical proofs, right? They don't mean I want some sort of scientific evidence that God exists or some sort of logical proof like the ontological argument or the cosmological argument or the argument from contingency. What they mean is, well, candidly, they don't know what they mean. But from the interviews with them, I would say that what they're sort of groping toward when telling their story is they wanted an experience, a palpable unveiling of God where they say, I felt it, I saw it, I heard it, I experienced it, I can't deny it, God's real. And I think the flip side of that coin is why is the interest in the paranormal and the occult. So that when they abandon religion, they start to look around for these experiences, these spiritual encounters that say, well, I don't know if it's God, but at least there's something enchanted about our world. Maybe our world is filled with spirits. There's a spiritual dimension to it. I don't know if it's God. Maybe it's the gods. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's ancestors. I don't care. But I want something to show up and do for me what I wanted God to do for me that he never did. And I think that's why you see the movement toward the paranormal. And this is, by the way, if you want to look into research on this particular topic, I'd point you to the work of Clay Rutledge, sociologist who did work specifically on the interest in the paranormal and the occult by those who are, religiously unaffiliated, by the nuns, and how this becomes sort of a religious substitute for them. I mentioned that there's also cognitive factors. What do I mean by this? Here I have in mind just certain social trends, the fact that man is a social animal, and as a result we have what I would call pre-rational, right, or pre-volitional cognitive tendencies. Peter Berger, right, is a sociologist. I could point you here, for example, to his book Rumors of Angels, which is a good reference point. The first few chapters are a good reference point for the thing I'm going to talk about here. Peter Berger points out something that was also talked about by William James, which is the idea that oftentimes we as individuals have certain cognitive parameters, right? Parameters of mind or disposition of belief that make certain things plausible to us and certain things implausible to us. There are certain things that, if you suggested to a person like that aliens exist, right? Some people would have sort of default settings where they would be inclined to say like, hey, I'm open to that possibility. Others people would be like, what are you talking about, right? And there's similar things like this with regard to God, right? Some people have an atheistic disposition and God becomes sort of, something that's unpalatable to them. And other people have a more theistic disposition, and there's sort of any number of things in between. Same with ghosts, any number of points like that. Now, one of the issues is that these live and dead options we oftentimes mistake for being, rational boundary lines. But in many ways, as William James points out, they're not, right? They are really pre-rational or pre-volitional boundary lines that, when we hear a proposition, it either strikes us as plausible, sometimes even strikes us as true, and other times strikes us as implausible. And we oftentimes presume that striking, that impression, is really a rational judgment, when in fact it's kind of pre-rational. It says more about us than about the proposition. And Peter Berger explores this in his book Rumors of Angels, where he talks about the phenomena of being a cognitive minority. And so what Berger points out is that you and I, even though we're rational beings, we are also animals, and specifically social animals. And so we have, as social animals, we have certain tendencies to flee from perceived dangers and lean into perceived safeties. And so when, for example, we discover that we are in the minority on something, that kicks in a certain animal impulse to protect, right? That's a perceived danger to be on the out of the larger crowd. And so what Berger points out is that instinct that says I am in danger because I am alone in this, or I am the minority in this, I'm vulnerable in this, kicks in when it comes to worldview issues. So if I have a discovery, a moment where I discover that a belief I hold is actually a minority view, right? Most people don't think this, or just the majority doesn't think this. This kicks in a certain animal impulse, because it's a threat, that throws me into crisis, right? The crisis of being a cognitive minority. And what Berger points out is there are really sort of three possibilities that emerge, how you respond. The one is that you abandon the belief entirely and you really sort of embrace whatever the majority view is. The second possibility is that you flee for safety, not by abandoning the belief and embracing the majority, but by hiding the belief. So yes, I'll retain it, but I'm not going to tell anybody I have that view because that would be dangerous. The third possibility is that you become a bold proselytizer. You go and you defend the belief, you admit that you have it, you argue in defense of it, and so on. Now, obviously, the third is the least likely outcome, the least likely choice when it comes to rational animals, because it moves against your protective instinct. It takes courage to do that sort of thing. And courage is something that has to be cultivated, and not everybody has it. In fact, probably the majority do not have courage. So that's the least likely decision to be made. More likely is the retention of the belief and the suppression of it for the sake of safety, or the abandonment of belief. Now, what this means is that cultural trends also have a certain inertia to them, right? As the cultural trend picks up steam and more people sign on to it, fewer and fewer people are going to admit that they actually oppose that view. They'll become silent, which only amplifies the impression that more and more people hold to it because any dissenters become silent. And over time, that ends up having the thrust, right? The inertia to pull more and more people either away from the belief or to become silent about the belief. But as Peter Berger points out, this is all pre-rational, right? Pre-volitional. This doesn't actually constitute a rational decision. This constitutes an animal impulse. And so what Berger points out, and he talks specifically about a phenomena that happens with anthropologists, right? That there is a tendency that when somebody steps into a culture and they discover that their view is in the minority position, that they are tempted to suddenly abandon the belief, right? That the belief suddenly goes into crisis about whether or not it's true, and they are tempted to abandon it and go native, as he puts it. Now, he uses the example of, let's say, somebody comes over, to the States from a culture that believes firmly that the stars determine our fate. And here they discover not many people think that. And so all of a sudden they're in a crisis about belief. And they're like, maybe I shouldn't believe that sort of thing. I should abandon that belief. And Berger points out, well, you might think, of course they should abandon it. That's silly. But what he points out is that if we take you and we transplant you to their culture, you'll have the same experience about your lack of belief in that premise. And his proof of this is that this happens with anthropologists all the time. Folks who immerse themselves in far-off cultures and then over time face the temptation to go native because their own disposition, their own cognitive inclinations suddenly get thrown into crisis as they're a cognitive minority. Now, Berger's point with this is not to suggest that there are no true or false positions. His point is to say that our inclination to think something is obviously true or obviously false is largely a social phenomena. It's largely something based on the culture we're in, which ends up influencing our cognitive boundary lines and telling us this is plausible, this is implausible, and so on. And what's needed is to actually make a rational assessment of what's true and false, not what you find plausible and implausible. Now, the reason I point this factor out is because inevitably, when you start to see in social media, in movies, in Hollywood, in music, whatever it is, when you start to see trends away from religion, which certainly we started to see more and more ramping up from the 1990s to 2015 and beyond, and then you have that combined with social media, which is actually amplifying that through algorithms, where I can scroll through social media and get impressions of what the overall ratio is on this sort of topic. We are now dealing in things where younger people are able to get the impression that they are in the cognitive minority, right? They look at movies, they look at music, they look at social media, and true or false, they can find the impression that there are plenty of people who find their beliefs laughable or contemptible or whatever else, and they're thrown into that crisis of belief. So that certainly is a further factor that plays into this whole thing in terms of things that set a religious person on edge and forces them to decide, do they want to be a proselytizer of this? Do they want to suppress it and hide the belief? Or do they want to just sort of abandon and embrace the broader culture? So I'd say those are three of the main sort of sociological factors that, play into the prediction of somebody becoming religiously unaffiliated. The factors in church and at home, the ones I mentioned, the existential ones having to do with where is God or a desire for a certain religious experience that isn't satisfied within their upbringing or within their religious experience. And then the third being social trends that end up compounding the crisis of belief over what they've been raised in. Now, I did mention there is a fourth one, which is theological factors. I'm going to avoid that one because it's an entirely different discussion. Suffice it to say, I think that the religiously unaffiliated, many of them, and I talked about this in the previous podcast, so you can look at that to see more on this topic. I talked about certain trends that drive them, that they are inherently not modernists in their way of thinking. And for that reason, they have certain inclinations in terms of their worldview of seeing nature as spiritual, of seeing religion as primarily being about the here and now, about believing that our world is spiritual and even haunted and so on and so forth. And for, long story short, they tend to think that there is a disconnect between those intuitions that they have about the world and about spirituality and the sort of Western forms of, Judeo-Christianity that they've encountered here, that end up seeing a disconnect, and they begin to search for a more palatable religious outlook. But as I said, that's a much longer discussion, and so I'll just leave it with the existential, the experiential, and the cognitive factors. Okay, so with that, let's talk about the evolution of a nun. As I said, there are really sort of 4 phases to the evolution of a nun. The first phase is not actually full dissociation. It's what's called denominational switching. So this is the same sort of thing that I mentioned, Smith and Sakink, whose research, sort of collated research, is useful for seeing. That usually the people who ultimately dissociate and become nuns, long before they become nuns, they usually begin a road of exploring alternative denominations. There's something about their experience, whether it's at home, it's at church, it's their encounter with God, it's the belief set, whatever it may be, that forces them into this crisis where they think, maybe there's a better version of this. So rather than, completely throwing off Christianity or something like this, they say, well, what are the other versions of Christianity out there? Other denominations, other traditions, whatever it may be. And they begin to toy and explore. So switching from one denomination to another is actually a prelude to dissociation. And, sometimes that doesn't go full dissociation. There's a bouncing from one denomination to another until they find a place that is a home. But oftentimes these sort of denominational switchers end up becoming the religiously unaffiliated. So that's phase 1, right? The disillusionment based on the various sort of factors that we talked about that lead to denominational switching. The second phase is actually where they fully dissociate. And this is where they move into, and this would be where I'd point you to the work of Clay Rutledge, this is where they toy with things like the paranormal and the occult. So as I mentioned, I talked about this last time, and as mentioned here, there is this inclination to think, well, I want to have an encounter with God. I wanted God to answer my prayers. I wanted to have an experience with God that proved to me, not through science or logic or reason, but through experience, that God is real, palpable, undeniable. And once, there's an abandonment of religion, there's still a desire, a spiritual hunger for some sort of encounter with the other side. As I mentioned in my first talk on this topic, very few of the nuns are atheists. If you ask them how many believe in God and you expand that definition to include, it doesn't have to be a personal deity, right? It can be a higher power of some kind that isn't necessarily what we'd call a person, whatever you mean by that term. The number is actually 90%, right? So 90% of the nuns believe in God or a higher power. Only 10% are atheists. And so there is still this spiritual hunger for that other side, for that encounter, for something. And for that reason, many of them become very interested in the paranormal. This can include ghosts, right? Many of them will admit that they're junkies for ghost hunting shows. They are fascinated with the paranormal. They're fascinated with spirit boards. They're interested in those who go and explore whether or not you can do EVPs with ghosts and things like that. And part of the reason is that they're still looking for that palpable, experiential proof of the other side. The way I put this last time is that everyone believes in ghosts, even the hard-bitten atheist who says he doesn't. And the reason is because if you lock him or anybody else in an abandoned insane asylum at night, they're scared. And the reason is not because they think a hobo lives there, right? They think something else may dwell in that place. And yes, they may sort of reason that away and say, no, that's just some sort of evolutionary impulse or irrational fear or whatever, and try to suppress it. But the fact that they have that instinct indicates that there's something primordial in us that says the world is haunted, right? That we live in a place filled with spirits. There is something on the other side. And with the nuns, they want to encounter that. They want that palpable encounter with it that says that that's true. They're not interested in a proof that just hits here in the mind, right? They're looking for something that hits here in the chest, right? When you encounter a ghost, if you think you encounter a spirit, at no point do you pause and go, is that really a spirit? Do I believe in ghosts? Is that what I'm seeing right now? In the moment, there is something that just hits you and you believe, right? You know you're experiencing the other side. It has a certain palpable certainty to it. And that's what the nuns are looking for. It's what they wanted from God and didn't feel like they ever got. And it's what they'll take from any spirit that's willing to talk to them, right? And so that's part of the delving into the paranormal and occult. And just to be clear about the paranormal, paranormal is pretty broad here, right? So this includes things like cryptozoology. It includes things like aliens. And yes, it includes things like ghosts, spirits, demons, and other sort of darker practices. But that's what they tend to turn to. There is a desire for this sort of mythologized world. And this also goes to the point that I mentioned last time, that they are not modernists, right? They're not interested in a mechanical, clockwork world on which there might be a god on the outside who's the cause of it and grounds morality. They want to know that this world here and now is, enchanted. They want to know that somehow there are spirits that dwell here. They want to know that they're not just living in a place that is just matter randomly colliding in motion. And that's what they're looking for in that. Now, what's interesting is Clay Rutledge's research on this didn't just look at the trend, which you can find that trend in, things like Pew and others. I encountered it in my own interviews with him. He actually looked specifically at the search for meaning. And this is a rather interesting point. Rutledge recognized that in terms of the nuns, when they're looking for that enchantment, that re-enchantment, they're actually looking for meaning, right? That has something to do with whether the world is meaningful. But when exploring the relationship between delving into the occult and experiencing meaning, he actually found an inverse relationship, where what happens is the deeper a person goes into the occult, the less meaning they experience in life. And that's really what happens in the second phase of the evolution of a nun. There's a disillusionment, right? They're in search for that encounter, but whether they find it or they don't, the deeper they go into it, the less meaning they actually experience. Now, I will say, as an aside here, based on my own research on the paranormal, which I've spent a lot of time on that topic, more time than I probably should have, because of, a paranormal movie I worked on where I went around with a priest, Father Maximus, who worked with Ed and Lorraine Warren, on whose case files the Conjuring franchise is based. I have an interview with Father Maximus on that. If it's not up right now, it will be up at some point on this podcast. But delving into his case files, looking into the paranormal and the sort of darker side of the occult and all the rest, and then having my own experiences with it. I will say, for my part, I'm convinced that it's demonic. If you understand what a demon is, which is basically a celestial being that is supposed to be good and minister to you, usher you to God, but has gone awry and has become twisted and distorted and now wishes to harm you rather than help you, it should be no surprise that the deeper you go into a relationship with that, the more you feel the spiritual vacuum take hold, that you actually end up dragged further away from meaning than deeper into it. And that's exactly the trend that Clay Rutledge noticed in his research. Now, what happens next, right? So you've begun with some sort of disillusionment with religion that has caused you to begin to switch, right? So you turn away from religion to disorganized religion and, sort of this experimentation with various spiritual realities and things like that. That comes up empty, and you actually have a crisis of meaning on the tail end of that. Where do the nuns go in phase 3? The answer is to politics. And so what happens is, having found a lack of meaning in the paranormal and the occult, there is a turn to political activism. In other words, I've come up empty in terms of meaning on the spiritual side, so now I turn to the political. And this could be anything from libertarian, anti-war, anti-Federal Reserve sort of stuff, or it could be more leftist stuff, like I'm concerned about critical race theory and systemic racism, or I'm concerned about the patriarchy and, those sorts of things. But what really happens there is in pouring yourself into the here and now and remedying the injustices of this world becomes really a substitute for religion. So when people refer to, like leftism as a cult, that's not entirely false. There really is a sense in which having come up empty in terms of organized religion, disorganized religion, and you have a turn toward the political. The political here is not just about, I want certain policies so I can live my life, as if the meaning is in my life and the politics is just sort of the rules of the playground. Instead, the politics is the meaning, right? That is the meaning being pursued. That's the thing where we're going to find purpose in this world. And that's one of the reasons why there really is sort of no end to it, right? If we have a victory here, we need to keep on going for a victory there. We're perpetually looking for injustices or problems in the system that can be righted, because the purpose is not found in the life lived underneath the politics. The politics is the purpose, right? And so that's really sort of phase 3 of the evolution of a nun. Now, what's interesting is a lot of folks, when they look at the nuns, they tend to presume that that's the end of the road. But there was already, prior to 2022, there was already research being done on reconversion of the nuns. In my own documentary, I shared my own story as somebody who had dissociated from religion and then returned to religion. And I shared that for a couple of reasons. I mean, the one reason was because I wanted to encourage religious people who maybe have a kid who's walked away from religion, that just because they walked away, that doesn't mean that's the end of their journey, right? And I wanted to give them some understanding of what might be going on and some sort of, hope in terms of the rest of the story. But also for the nuns themselves. The fact of the matter is, like, nuns rarely get to talk about religion in any sort of serious way. I was surprised how many nuns that I interviewed, after interviewing them, were grateful. And this was what clued me in. I realized, you guys don't get to talk about religion very often, right? For religious people, that's kind of weird. You go to church, you listen to a guy talk about religion, you engage in the religion, you go to a coffee hour, you talk about what you're reading. It might be a religious book, right? Like, it's just common conversation to talk about religion. It's all over the place. Whereas if you're a nun, when are you going to talk about religion, and with who? Right? Because on the one hand, you've abandoned, the faith of your parents. And so you don't want to talk with them, right? That's going to be awkward. It's a point of tension. They're probably going to proselytize you. You're suspicious of religious people generally who might be in their circle. What are you up to? You're trying to draw me back into this. So are you going to talk to your atheist buddy who's dogmatically opposed to it? Probably not, because if you're a nun, more likely than not, 90%, you're not actually an atheist. So you're not a materialist, atheist, new atheist type. They're just as dogmatic in a different way that you don't want anything to do with. And so who are you going to talk to, right? This is a touchy, tense thing, and you don't have a lot of occasions to delve into the topic. So what I found is that many nuns never really get a chance to talk about it. So much so, I mentioned in the previous podcast on this, a couple that I interviewed who had been married for 3 years and never talked about whether they believed in God. They didn't know each other's position on that topic. That's how rarely they get to talk about this subject. And it's understandable. And so many of these nuns, by just getting a sort of safe space, if we want to call it that, to tell their story and say what they think and explore ideas, we're grateful for that, because that's rare for them. And what I wanted to offer to the nuns was a sense that you're not alone, right? You're not a weirdo for going through this journey. Plenty of people do. But also tell them that just because right now you're dissociated from a religion doesn't mean that's the end of your journey. And that's one of the reasons why in that documentary I shared my own story of the journey back. because I think there's too many people who look at the nuns in a static way, right? Like, who are they? Their identity. They are people who have no religious affiliation. And I'm inclined, based on my own experiences and other things that I witnessed firsthand, to think many nuns are on a journey, beginning in a religion that they don't connect with for a variety of reasons, journeying away from religion, and then returning back to religion of some kind. And that really is what I think we're starting to see in this trend, where we saw the number peak at 31%, and now we're starting to see it decline. I expect that that's going to continue on, and we're going to see the evolution of nuns carry out moving forward. Now, there's been less research done in terms of the return of nuns to religion, but there has been some. There's been, the HuffPost has done articles relating to observations about this trend of a return to religion. We've also seen articles in the New York Times. Hall Fromm is one who has done probably the most direct research on this trend, looking specifically at reconversion toward Catholicism. And then, I have my own sort of less formal research based on my experiences that I've observed firsthand in terms of my experiences with and interviewing of the nuns. One of the things that's rather interesting is that a consistent trend across all of these observations, whether you're talking about the HuffPost, the New York Times, Hall Fromm, myself, is that when nuns return to religion, when they turn back, they tend to return to extremely traditional forms of religion. Let's say like Latin Mass Catholics or Eastern Orthodoxy, something like that. Usually they don't go to something that is more liberal or contemporary, something like that. They're looking for something that is more ancient, something that is more traditional, something that requires quite a bit of them in terms of lifestyle and devotion, and family ritual and all the rest. They're looking for an all-encompassing experience. Another thing that's interesting about this trend is that when they embrace those more traditional religions, they rather quickly abandon viewpoints, political viewpoints, social viewpoints that are at odds with the religion. Now, the reason I think this is particularly interesting, why, let's say, a leftist becomes Eastern Orthodox and all of a sudden they cease to carry leftist views and they take on more traditional Christian views, is it demonstrates that with the nuns, they are not being driven by the social issues. This is something that is a mistake that oftentimes happens, specifically in mainline Protestantism. There's a presumption that, because somebody abandons religion and they become a leftist activist, for example, that it must be that they had certain social views that were at odds with traditional Christianity. That's why they abandoned religion. And therefore, if Christianity is going to get them back, it needs to become progressive in ways that mirror the culture. The evidence is actually quite the contrary. The views, right, the political views, whether they're libertarian or they're leftist or whatever, are actually symptoms of the journey away from religion. They're not the cause of the journey away from religion. I actually already went through what the real causes are: experiential, existential, so on, what drives them away from religion. And that's one of the reasons why, if they discover meaning once again and return to a more traditional religion, they immediately abandon, any political views that are at odds with the traditional religious viewpoint. Because the search is not for a political system, right? The search is not for a social utopia. The search is for meaning. And so initially that meaning is thrown into crisis when they begin to doubt the religion. It becomes a pursuit of meaning when they look to the paranormal and the occult. When that comes up empty and they look to the political system is a substitute for religious meaning. And then if they find meaning in a traditional religion and it draws them back in, they fully embrace it, abandoning the prior viewpoints. Because again, the viewpoints are not what's driving the journey. The search for meaning is what's driving the journey. And so if they find that in a traditional religion, they embrace it fully. And that's an important point to understand. A very prominent example of this turn back to religion is Russell Brand. So here, take a look.
It's not just me that's experiencing a spiritual awakening across the world. There appears to be a return to religion. But across the world, this seems to me like a time where a set of values not derived from the materialist culture are becoming increasingly relevant. When you look at that ghoulish gala that was the White House press correspondents' dinner, it's pretty obvious that we are a rudderless society, damned and doomed. Obviously, I've been through a lot of things personally. I know you've been through a lot of things personally too. But for me, I've reached a point where the figure, the personage, the presence of Christ became overwhelming, unavoidable, welcome, necessary. Like, suffering is not fun, is it? You know what it is to suffer, right? You know what it is to lose people. You know what it is to be attacked. You know what it is to be persecuted. You know what it is to sometimes feel the actual presence of evil in your life. Where do you turn to? Where do you turn to in those moments? Well, a lot of people across the world are turning to religion.
Okay, so what causes somebody to begin this turn back? There are several different factors that come into play. Just like in phases 1 and 2 of the evolution of a nun, where there is a lack of fulfillment, right? The pursuit of meaning is coming up in some ways empty. And that's one of the factors, right? That political activism is not somehow actually providing a proper substitute for the pursuit of meaning. That's one contributing factor. A second contributing factor, and this is from Fromm's work, is encounters with people who are religious, right? So this is actually the flip side of the coin that I mentioned in terms of existential factors. So you'll notice that so many of the factors had to do with, are my parents religiously homogenous? Do they really value this? Do they practice it out there in the church and are involved? They practice it in here in the home, right? Do they teach us about it? Do they bring us into, the practices of it? Is it incorporated into our lives? It's also at church. Do I see clergy who are committed? Do I see a community that believes I belong and that this matters, and so on and so forth? If dissociation is driven largely by those sorts of factors where it's I don't see a commitment from my parents, or I see hypocrisy from the church, or whatever it is. Oftentimes a catalyst for driving them back to religion is encountering an embodiment of the things that were lacking in their early experiences. So Fromm points this out specifically, that when people start to have encounters with lived devotion, right, that really embodies the thing that was missing in what they observed and experienced growing up, that is what begins to open a person up and say, okay, what is it that you have that I want, right? You seem to have purpose. You seem to have grounding. You seem to have worldview. You seem to be at peace. You seem to have these sorts of experiences. I want to understand this. And that, when it's followed with non-judgmental dialogue here. And by non-judgmental, well, I'll say a word about what I mean by that. But that doesn't mean compromise of the worldview. And I'll explain that more in a second. But where there's an open, non-judgmental, safe dialogue that follows with that person who is devout, that begins to open the person up and create a pathway, basically, back to religion. Now, on the non-judgmental front, it's interesting because I saw this firsthand, almost accidentally, when I was working on the documentary. So what was intriguing is, in terms of my pre-production interviews with the unaffiliated, I wanted to make sure that the nuns were comfortable. I wanted them to see me just as a director, right, who's not going to have any judgment on them for being dissociated from religion. And for that reason, even though I told them truthfully the full structure of the story, right, we're going to do these one-on-one portraits, we're going to have group discussions amongst the nuns, and we're going to actually tell the story of one who abandoned religion and then came back. I didn't tell them the one who abandoned religion came back was me. So they had no idea whether I was religiously affiliated or not. And in fact, whenever they would ask me questions, because I wanted to keep it that way, I would always say, well, it doesn't really matter. We're here to talk about you, not me. And so what was intriguing was the more comfortable they felt with me, the less judged they felt by me. You know, the more they saw that I was genuinely interested in their story and could understand it and was curious and all the rest, the more eager they were to hear what I thought. And so that's really, when you're talking about non-judgmental, you're not talking about compromising your beliefs, right? What you're talking about is genuine interest in the person, genuine willingness and desire to hear what they think and what their story is. And that interest, you know, in them, that concern and care for them is the sorts of things that Fromm is talking about. That when people encounter deeply religious people who have something that was lacking in their experiences, has a sense of meaning that they currently hunger for and haven't found, whether in the paranormal or the political or whatever it is, and then that person is genuinely a safe place to discuss these things, that begins to open them up. And that openness is what begins to move them down the path to a return to religion. And that's one of the reasons why the reconversion, like in Catholicism, this is what Fromm's looking at, is oftentimes extremely traditional, right? And this is true in like the HuffPost and the New York Times, that many of those sorts of articles that talked about this sort of phenomena, they talk about how oftentimes it's nuns. Now this time it's N-U-N. I don't want to confuse everybody here, but you know that some of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, end up, you know, pouring themselves into relationship with nuns, N-U-N, because they're devout, because they have peace, because they have meaning, because they have joy, they have certain things that they feel like they're missing, and they want to understand that more. And those sorts of open, close relationships begin to move them toward a very devout, very traditional religion. And I've seen this too firsthand with monks. I've seen this firsthand with folks who just pour themselves into Eastern Orthodoxy, any number of things. So that's one of the factors that's there. Another factor that is oftentimes there as well is really sort of prompted by, well, actually, I think, you know, somebody who put it well recently is actually Joe Rogan. So let's look at a recent clip of him.
But don't you think there has to be some sort of field of value that can orient people into like, hey, let's do things a little bit better because these things actually matter. There is right and wrong. There is morality. Yeah. There is certain, like...
Well, unfortunately, the problem with living in a secular society and living in a society that has a lot of people that are atheists, that have no belief system at all, is you find a belief system. And that's a lot of these people that call themselves atheists, or they've subscribed to the religion of woke. You know, their God is equity and inclusiveness. Their God is this ideology that they think that you have to subscribe to. And that's why it's spooky, because people, human beings seem to have a very strong desire for some sort of order and form and some sort of pattern that they can follow that seems to be the right way to go. And they can be led by cults, they can be led by groups of people, they can be led by, you know, intolerant governments and evil armies and corrupt politicians. They can be led. But I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand the need to have some sort of divine structure to things, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and of truth. And a lot of that comes from religion. A lot of people's moral compass and the guidelines that they've used to follow to live a just and righteous life has come from religion. And unfortunately, a lot of very intelligent people, they dismiss all of the positive aspects of religion because they think that the stories are mere superstitious fairy tales, that, you know, they have no place in this modern world, and, you know, we're inherently good and your ethics are based on your own moral compass and we all have one. And that's not necessarily true. We need Jesus. I think, for real. Like, if he came back now, it'd be great. Like, Jesus, if you're thinking about coming back.
Right now?
Now's a good time.
Yeah, pretty soon, yeah.
Now's a good time.
Well, there's a lot of people that think that might be coming.
Well, it might be.
Mark of the beast. If there is the Christianity part and Jesus wants to come back and save everything.
It'd be good right around now.
Yeah.
Like, don't wait till the election.
Okay, so here Joe is talking about something that I've observed with some other folks who begin a journey from non-affiliation back to religion, which is that they begin to recognize that there's something that's gone awry culturally. They're noticing trends in terms of cultural thinking and conversations and disputes that strike them as utterly bizarre. For example, the entire trans discussion. It just seems a bridge too far to them. The idea not just that, men might become women through surgery and hormones or vice versa, but also that somehow this might be for the betterment of children, right, to cut off a child's genitals. And that just seems so crazy to them that somehow we got here, that they start to look for people who feel grounded, right, who have some sort of worldview that provides some sort of guidance and structure to their thinking. Now, the thing is, if they're in phase 3, they're not going to look to religious people. Right? They're going to look to political figures. And so oftentimes political figures like, say, a Jordan Peterson ends up becoming a certain starting point for grounded thinking about how should I live? How should I think? How should I see the world? And this rabbit trail, right, this going down this rabbit hole into different political thinkers like, Jordan Peterson, one of the things that oftentimes stands out to them is that they notice that a lot of the figures that they listen to are religious, right? They're devout Jews or they're devout Catholics or, something like that. And so for that reason, that begins to, just that fact, not that the person is always talking about religion, but the very fact that they seem to have a religious inclination, or they seem to take religion seriously, or they seem to think that religion is important for stabilizing and grounding culture and building families and all that sort of stuff, they begin to think, maybe I'm wrong about this whole, I can abandon religion and still have just a stable worldview. Now, on a deeper level, let me just offer here as an aside, in an earlier podcast, I talked about just the importance, my insistence that one of the most important questions in the history of ideas is the question of realism versus nominalism. I'm not going to spend, extensive time on this topic because you can see the other podcast for that. But suffice it to say, the question of realism is this, right? Realism recognizes that you and I, when we look out into the world, we see certain structures. We think in terms of, genus, animal, species, human, common properties, bipedal. And the question is, when the mind does that, when the mind looks out into the world and organizes things and recognizes these stable structures by which the world is ordered, is the mind abstracting something that's out there? Those structures are real. The world really is that way. And if you say yes, you're a realist. Or are those structures mental fictions? Is it just that the world is just random matter in motion that's really sort of in itself disorganized, but the mind needing to sort of have a way of processing it ends up imposing structures that aren't really there? So these are just projections, mental fictions of the mind. If you say that, then you are a nominalist, from the Latin word nomen. These are all just names. Now, the case that I made is that one very useful way of looking at the history of ideas is that it's the story of two roads, the road of realism on the one hand and the road of nominalism on the other. The road of realism, we journey from Plato into Aristotle, into folks like the Stoics and the Neoplatonists, but that also converges with Judaism and Christianity. And a lot of, Western views of politics, of rights, of even the sciences are born out of that realist trajectory, including things like morality, natural law, all the rest. Whereas when you look at the story of nominalism, even though it begins with its empiricist tendency to bear fruit with regard to the empirical sciences, it also very quickly begins to cause reason to unravel. It moves into skepticism, It has trouble grounding morality, and so it tends toward utilitarianism, where the outcome justifies the action. And then ultimately, it begins to move toward atheism and manifests political philosophies on the left, like Marxism, and on the right, like sort of Nietzschean Nazism. So while all of that probably seems pretty abstract and far removed from, sort of our on-the-ground contemporary cultural conversations, it couldn't be more relevant. And I make this case in the prior podcast. I show how the majority of issues in the current culture war are really divides between people who have a realist instinct and people who have a nominalist instinct. Now, part of my critique there is that most folks don't know that that's the real divide going on, but that is the divide. So if you take, for example, trans, right, to take a very heated contemporary example, the first premise of trans, that gender is a social construct, is actually a nominalist premise, right? It's suggesting that there are not innate structures in terms of gender, in terms of sex, and therefore if we, manipulate the matter and we give it a new name and we embrace the new pronouns and things like that, we actually have changed what it is, because all of those rules, all the things, all the names, all the structures, those are all just conventions. They're just names that we apply. Whereas the folks who look at that and go, I'm pretty sure a penis is a penis and a man is a man. I'm pretty sure even if we hack apart certain body parts, we don't change what they are. Mutilated penis is still a penis. It's just mutilated, right? Things like that. That's a realist instinct. And so at bottom, that discussion is ultimately really a realist nominalist divide. And that's why they're looking at each other going, I don't understand where you're coming from, because the most foundational, fundamental issue of how they see the world is already utterly disconnected and at odds. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I really do think when you're talking about nominalist worldviews, everything becomes up for grabs, because there really are what the base premise is ultimately that there are no innate structures out there. It really is just matter in motion. And all the sort of structures that we see in terms of rights, in terms of morality, in terms of, basic divisions of genera and species and common properties and all the rest is all just mental fictions. And therefore, if we recognize that and we can be the Superman to cast it off, we can begin to remake reality however we want, because reality is just sort of an amorphous blob that is in our own hands. And so for that reason, there really is no limiting principle. And so that's why you can start to wander more and more into a form of self-actualization where, body positivity, we can't talk about healthy and unhealthy. We can only talk about different, right? Ableism, right? We can't talk about well-formed, properly formed versus malformed, or something like that. We can only talk about different, right? We can't talk about objective morality or natural law. We can only talk about, what works for me versus for you. And so what you inevitably get is you get this unhinged, ungrounded, perpetually changing, perpetually in flux, wholly unstable reality. And that's the thing that so many nuns begin to experience in phase 3, where they begin to say, that doesn't seem right to me, right? There's still a realist impulse that they're wrestling with, which says, I'm pretty sure that reality does have structures, and I'm pretty sure meaning requires that I discern what those structures are. I need some sort of grounded, structured way of existing and seeing the world and working through problems and coming to decisions and choices and the rest. And for that reason, they begin to look to people who can offer answers to those sorts of questions. And like I said, since they're still in a political phase, they tend to look at largely political figures, whether you're talking about, a commentator like Michael Knowles, or you're talking about, somebody who's politically controversial or socially controversial like Jordan Peterson or whatever it is. And over time, they begin to see the connection between having a structured worldview and having a religious worldview. And that really should be no surprise if you understand the history of ideas. The realists, like Plato, ultimately did trace realism back to God. So it's not just the Christians and the Jews that end up having a theistic worldview. realism tends to naturally trend toward some form of theism or pantheism or panentheism, because essentially what you're suggesting, what you're concluding when you're a realist, is that structures, ideas, meaning, purpose, teleology, right? That those are somehow prior to an organizing matter. They are not an afterthought imposed upon matter. And once you say that reality, the first principles of reality are meaning, purpose, structures, are inherently mental and products of mind, that means the world itself originates from mind, capital M, something like a God. And so no wonder that the realists all tend towards some form of theism, pantheism, panentheism, something like that. And so this becomes the trend back, right? So this is the other trend, the other pathway back. As I said, the first pathway back is a direct encounter with religious people who somehow have or embody the thing that was missing in their early experience. The other possibility is oftentimes just recognizing a deficit in the purely political that ends up causing them to look to somebody who offers some sort of structural thinking for grounding, their worldview. And oftentimes those people who offer that have a religious bent. And for that reason, they begin to take religion seriously. And that sends them on a religious journey to say, well, which religion? And oftentimes, as I said, that search for which religion tends to drive people to older, more traditional faiths, like, as I said, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Orthodox Judaism, something like that. Now, I will say about this second path, one of the things that it exposes is the myth of secular neutrality. There really is a certain naivete that is starting to dissipate regarding the idea that somehow we can just come up with common sense, common principles that don't require religion. We can check worldview at the door, not deal with issues of God or issues of metaphysics or things like that. And we can come up with neutral principles that everybody can agree on, that are common sense. And these become principles of governance and structuring the world and structuring life and structuring morality and whatever else. And what we're starting to see right now is the proof that that's not true. The plausibility of this myth was largely based on the fact that we were in a broadly Christian culture. So even when people abandoned religion, they still had largely Christian sentiments. Their instincts, right, to hearken to Peter Berger, right, their broad default settings in terms of how they thought and the boundary lines of how they thought were largely set up by Christianity, even if they were now in some level of violation of them. But what we've seen is as the culture begins to turn away from Christianity and even turn against it, and the fumes of Christianity dissipate, there is no mitigating principle from preventing the nominalism from wading into full-blown relativism morally and metaphysically that just continues to move further and further and further away until really what you have is a culture so divided that no, there are no unifying common sense principles. We can't even agree on whether chopping off a child's genitals is actually helpful or harmful to the child. And that really does expose the myth of secular neutrality. So the myth has really lived on the fumes of Christianity. The fact that those fumes allowed a certain level of agreement on certain basic principles about right and wrong, about rights and things like that. But the more and more they dissipate, and the more and more it becomes clear that we have differing first principles, realism versus nominalism, what ends up happening is there is no tether between us. And so there is no ability to find common sense, neutral principles because there is no common sense on these topics. And that's why ultimately we need to, do away with this myth of secular neutrality. You actually have to deal with issues of religion and metaphysics and worldview and come to some sort of grounding principles from which you can work in your discussion and your disagreements and in your governing principles and the rest if you're going to have any sort of common governments, governance agreement concerning rights, morality, and the rest. Otherwise, it just sort of boils down to war because you completely disagree with each other. You have no common principles. But that whole thing is a story for another time. So there you have it. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Podcast.